editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert Service, Business Ukraine and Live Today magazine's publisher, Mr. Peter Dickinson, is with us very much alive in the studio. It is a pleasure, sir. Hello.
Hi.
How have you been doing lately?
That's a difficult question in Ukraine these days to answer. I'm okay. I mean, my standard answer, I think, is I'm okay. My family are okay. We're safe. We're healthy, so I can't complain. It's tough times, but life goes on.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, for being here in Ukraine. Secondly, for being here in this very studio.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Atlantic Council, let me quote, a non-partisan organization that promotes constructive U.S. leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the central role of the Atlantic community meeting today's global challenges. So you are the voice of America, just with a slight touch of British accent. Is that true?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I'm the editor for the Atlantic Council here in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council is a think tank, a Washington D.C. based think tank that dates back to the Kennedy administration, so the 60s, and it's always been about, as the name suggests, building a transatlantic community. So it's very much in support of Ukraine and Ukraine, what Ukraine's been looking to achieve now, not just at the moment, but for the last 20 years, going back to the Orange Revolution. Even.
Right. One of your articles, I loved it actually, on New Voice of Ukraine, is titled "NATO poses a threat to Russian imperialism, not Russian security." Nicely put, sir. Russia obviously uses vast amounts of venomous propaganda and trying to do its job, and it's working. I mean, look at Fico, look at Orban. However, thanks to the Atlantic Council, the free world has Digital Forensic Research Lab. What is that?
Well, that's what I mean. It's a big organisation. That's one of the branches that does a lot of analysis of, especially the information sphere, about what's going on in the information
disinformation, analysing it, right?
Essentially, yes. How it works, how disinformation works, where messages are put out, how they're spread. Really sort of forensically analysing this whole process that's become it's become a major factor of the information environment over the last 10 years or so, since social media really became the key source of news for most people. Digital
Forensic Lab. It's a nice title. Someone I know in the UK, he says the Russia is a mill of lies producing it on an industrial scale. So just this Digital Forensic Lab, do we have any countermeasures for Russian propaganda? Any tool that you can suggest, or maybe or maybe you can speculate on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fascinating topic, how to counter the disinformation, and I think going back to this is something I've been involved in for many years, and at first I think there was an expectation, and when I say at first, I'm going back to 2014, around the time of. Of course, that's not when it began, but that's I think when people became very aware that Russia was using disinformation as a foreign policy tool.
When you say people, pardon me for interrupting you. When you say people, you mean the West?
I think, I would say, international / Western audiences. Right, I think people became very aware of it. They became aware that this was a big factor in Russian foreign policy and that Russia was investing very heavily in this. And initially, the expectation was, okay, well, let's debunk these lies. Russia says X, Y, Z. Let's debunk them and let's show that this is not true. And that will be how to resolve the issue. Right. Doesn't work because
that was my question.
It doesn't work. I think it's important to debunk things. I think you can't leave a lie just uncontested. You need to contest them and say, okay, listen, this is not factually correct, and this is why, and put the actual factual realities out there. But that's not nearly enough. It's not going to be. It's not adequate, and you're going to
absolutely.
So I think honestly, my personal opinion on this issue now, I would say the most effective thing is to have a stronger narrative yourself. I think it's a battle of narratives. Russia's disinformation is very attractive very often. They play on very attractive issues.
Yes.
They present it very well. They play on existing fears.
And the pressure is it's unbelievable. They exactly as you say, they invest heavily.
Yeah. Huge amounts of money, but they know their market, they know their audience. So they play the NATO card, for example, blaming NATO for the war in Ukraine, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, works very well with Western audiences. It doesn't work very well with the Global South because they're not really preoccupied by NATO. So with the Global South, then they use the issue of Western colonialism, Western imperialism, and position Russia as an anti-imperial force. So it's horses for courses. They find a good narrative to fit each different audience they wish to reach, and they shape their narratives very specifically to appeal to these audiences. So it's extremely sophisticated.
It is.
And just debunking it by saying, well, this is not true. I think people aren't very responsive to that, and also you don't reach the same scale of audience. So I would say the most effective tool is really to have attractive and engaging and convincing narratives of your own, and to promote them as much as you can, as much as possible.
Well, let's try to debunk it in a proper way. The narrative that NATO is coming to, I don't know, to attack Russia, or what they are saying. That how to do it. Let's just
okay. Very very good example. I think the first thing we need to say is it's not effective to say okay, Russia's just lying here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Russia
it works for other ones.
Russia clearly doesn't like NATO. That's a fact, and Russia doesn't like the fact that NATO's expanded. But the issue here is not that Russia doesn't like it. The issue is Russia's opposition to NATO legitimate? What is Russia opposed to? And this is where it gets interesting, because I think if Russia's narrative is, well, NATO is a threat to Russia, and Putin often talks about this, and other Kremlin officials often talk about this. They say, well, NATO is a threat to Russia, so our response is legitimate. Our invasion of Ukraine is legitimate. Other things we do are legitimate. But actually, we see from Russia's own actions, especially in relation to its response to Finland joining NATO in 2023, like last year, almost a year and a half ago now. Yeah. They really did nothing about that. They made no attempt to block Finland's membership of NATO and Finland's accession process. They didn't oppose it. They didn't even voice opposition, never mind taking action.
They could do that, right?
Which they could easily have done. And they also, since then, have effectively demilitarized their border with Finland. So essentially, Putin is proving by his own actions that they don't view NATO as a physical threat, as a security threat to Russia itself. Right. They are simply object. Right. And people say, okay, yeah, but Finland's not Ukraine. I say, yeah, well, that's true, but NATO is NATO. So NATO in Ukraine and NATO in Finland, there's no real quantitative difference there from a military point of view. The difference is that Russia wants to conquer Ukraine. It doesn't want to conquer Finland. So it's not about NATO, it's about Ukraine, it's about Finland. So that is I think that in a nutshell, that's how you challenge this narrative. You say, well, look, guys. So then the question is does Russia have a legitimate right to conquer Ukraine? Well, of course not. So then the whole NATO argument then starts to break down, and you say, well, if Russia doesn't view NATO as a threat to itself, if Putin understands perfectly well that Russia is not under no threat, then what's the legitimacy of this NATO argument? It's really not legitimate at all.
It's just a great litmus. I mean, you take Putin's actions, and on these actions, you show it doesn't work.
Yeah. He said. I mean, he very clearly said. He said very clearly, we're not worried about Finland. We don't care. Yeah, and then they withdraw their troops.
Right. Okay. So. I would like to talk for hours on this topic. We don't have hours. I know there's a long way back home for you. So, say Trump and Zelensky will meet in Switzerland. Say it is happening. Any ceasefire, any terms. Do you believe there is a chance that the decision and the process would not involve Ukraine? I mean, talking about Ukraine should be involving Ukraine, right?
Well, that's always been the narrative. Yeah, no Ukraine, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's always been the position of all the Western leaders. But I think it's likely that Trump would look to have some sort of a summit with Putin. That appeals to him and his worldview and the way he sees things happening. But he'll be in for a very rude awakening if he thinks he can make decisions without Ukraine. That's not going to happen. And I think Ukraine wouldn't allow that to happen. President Zelensky wouldn't allow that to happen. But also other Western countries wouldn't allow that to happen. So he'll have his meeting. He'll have his photo op, as it were, his big stage event with Putin. I think that's likely. But they won't be able to make decisions without Ukraine now. I don't think so.
Great. I mean, and also this trilateral meeting it's impossible. I can't imagine Zelensky sitting, at one table with Trump and Putin, and then Zelensky. Is that?
I can't. I mean, I think it's. I think it would be very difficult for any Ukrainian leader, President Zelensky or anyone else, to engage directly with the Russians after all that's happened. So I think it would be a case of a deal being brokered and then perhaps being
discussed
by different sides, and then at a technical level agreed. Okay. But I think it would be all sides would look to frame it within a very broad international sort of coalition of different, or institutional maybe with the Americas, maybe with the European Union involved, maybe even with the United Nations involved, something like that.
Okay, another topic that I just craving to discuss with you: North Koreans. I mean, Russia is. Some sources say that Russia is trying to just eliminate every and any sign of North Koreans being involved in this criminal war. Why? If Russia is that big, is doing their best, worst to show it, why just... they're certainly not trying to save their own folk. Or are they? Because using the North Koreans, what is the sense in all that?
Well, I mean, I think the Russians are, on the one hand, Russia is a huge country with huge resources, and they have a lot of spare capacity. They can recruit a lot more soldiers if they want to. They can bring a lot more troops into the army.
But they can't do that. Why?
But they can't. But they don't want to mobilize, because I think Putin is very Putin. You know, one of the great paradoxes of Putin is this idea of this. He's this. You know, he's an all-powerful dictator, and he's always portrayed as extremely popular, and he has this huge mandate. You know, 80% approval ratings or something like this. I think 88. You know, why not 98?
Exactly.
I think in reality he's very much aware, very conscious that it's a very fragile thing. His regime, his grip on power is a lot more fragile than he would like people to believe.
Russian nation, you mean?
Yeah, in Russia, and if you look, I mean, if we look the obvious example would be the Wagner mutiny in the summer of 2023, where it was a very brief affair, but in that space of like 36 or 48 hours, very quickly it looked like the regime might crumble, and nobody came to his rescue. No one rallied around the Kremlin, rallied around Putin, you know, said we're going to stand with the great leader. On the contrary, people were looking to flee. People were taking planes out everywhere they were trying to, you know, it was a very, very vivid example of the fact that this guy actually, his grip on power is not that strong, and he knows that if he pushes the mobilization issue, and if he dips into this mobilization fund that does exist in Russia, the chances of that causing a significant opposition is quite high. So bringing in North Korean soldiers is attractive in that sense. I mean, they've exhausted a lot of their resources. You know, they did the first mobilization. It was very, very unpopular. You had about 1 million Russians fleeing the country. It's hit their economy hard. Then you had they've almost emptied the prisons. They've almost gone through that now. They're offering crazy money now for recruits, but even that, you know, volunteers. But even that, you know, the well's starting to run dry there. They're offering guys now 30,000 euros or something just to sign up, and then, you know, 3,000 euros a month. That's huge money. I mean, that would be attractive, I think, in a lot of Western countries. In Russia, that's just insane. I mean, not for everybody, but if you're offering people, I mean, and especially if you put it into the local equivalent. I mean, 30,000 euros signing on fee for a Russian is potentially life-changing. I mean, they can get real estate for that. They can get property. Then they get their security for their children's education,
and you get a big job.
Yeah, and so it's you know that's wild. But even with that sort of money, they're now starting to get to the point where it's difficult to get volunteers. So when the North Koreans are in the mix and say, okay, we can send troops, like, okay, that works, you know, because there's a lot, you know, we're talking about 10,000 now, 12,000 North Korean troops, but North Korea has a lot of troops.
Exactly. You know, so, well, that was my next question. I mean, how many of them are?
Well, one would assume that if we don't see a more robust response from the West, and frankly, at this point, we've not seen that at all.
No.
What's the difference from a North Korean perspective to send 10,000 soldiers or to send 50,000 soldiers or 100,000?
Right.
I mean, I don't see a huge difference, and that's very dangerous because, of course, that does become a much bigger factor then. If they're sending, you know, if we've got hundreds of thousands of North Korean soldiers fighting in Europe, you know, it's already very serious. But, you know, people, I think the Western leaders need to understand that this is a very specific line that's being crossed, and if they don't react, we're going to see a much bigger flood of these soldiers coming into the war zone.
Do you believe the West is going to see this line that you just drew?
I think that...
you drawn that line.
No, the North Koreans have crossed that line. I mean, it's a line that was always there. But I mean, it's always, frankly, you know, the Western response has
you
been...
personally, do you believe in that?
I think it's a factor. I think it's a significant factor that's now really, you know, it's weighing on them heavily. I think they are aware because you know, one of the things that's always been playing very heavily in Western policy making has been the idea of containing the war in Ukraine. Now, of course, that's a very ugly way of looking at it, from a very inhumane way of looking at it.
But very pragmatic.
But that's the Western response, has been, let's contain this. So when you have a large number of North Koreans fighting, okay, they're fighting in Ukraine or in Kursk, in Ukraine, in occupied Russia, but they're not going to stay there. They're going to take the experience they're gaining back to Korea, back to the Korean Peninsula, and then that's going to create huge threats for South Korea. Now, these guys are coming in, the North Koreans are coming in, they're learning about drone warfare, electronic warfare.
Well, everything there is
everything.
that.
I mean, like, this is the most sophisticated war that's ever, war that's ever been fought, ever. And the North Koreans are gaining absolutely priceless, from their perspective, experience that they're going to take back, so that's broadening the war. The Iranians, the same. The Iranians are gaining very valuable experience in terms of drone warfare, missile warfare, ballistic missile warfare in Ukraine that they're also going to apply. That's a big threat to Israel, as well as other countries, but specifically to Israel.
Small planet, isn't it?
It's a small planet, and it's getting smaller, and the potential for the Russian invasion of Ukraine to become a genuine world war.
Right.
I mean, some say it already is. I would say it's probably a little bit over egging it, but it's certainly becoming a very, very international conflict, and that's something they want to contain. So, to come back to what your original point, yes, I think it's a really significant factor for Western policymakers when they look at this, decision makers, when they're saying, okay, this is getting out of hand now, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get, we're going to see this becoming broader and broader.
3 years in a row.
Yeah, after 3 years of this. So, slowly, it's obviously very, unsatisfactory how slow these processes are going. But that's a big factor. The North Korean thing is significant.
Everyone I know in Ukraine, they say that whatever the ceasefire terms are, Ukraine should be getting ready to another invasion, to another war, whatever comes. As a ceasefire, we should be just ready. Do you believe in that this is true?
Well, I think certainly, yeah. For the foreseeable future, the threat of further Russian aggression will be there, and that it's never going to go. And if you look at Russia's, the motives here that are driving Russia, Russia's the imperial narratives that Putin and almost everybody in the Russian establishment openly embraces, it's difficult to see how they could ever come to terms with an independent Ukraine. Right. I mean, I think they never came to terms with an independent Ukraine.
No. They
obviously haven't, and I don't think they ever will. So yeah, in that sense, the threat will always be there. And I think when we talk about a potential peace process in the coming months, the idea, the issue of long-term security guarantees for Ukraine is absolutely central. I think that is the central issue. I think territorially, there's room for negotiations. Ukraine has more or less said already, we're ready to forego the full liberation of the country militarily and leave that for a diplomatic process, further down the road. Essentially saying, okay, we accept that, but we are not prepared to accept a ceasefire where we're left just in limbo, in geopolitical limbo, without those guarantees.
Well, because Ukraine been there already.
Yeah, they've been there already. They know what it is, and they understand what's coming. And if Ukraine is left, I mean, if you look at Russia's position, what we hear a lot from Russia, yes, Russia says Ukraine must respect or must recognize the territorial realities on the ground. Okay, I think Ukraine is prepared to discuss that. But what Russia also says, and what Putin has said very consistently, is that Ukraine must be disarmed and it must be neutral. Now, why does,
What about the genocide? What about, I mean, let's destroy Ukraine to appease Putin. You can't appease a monster.
Well, appeasement never works. I mean, it's kind of.
How come it's not obvious to the people in the West? Why do I'm a journalist. I consider myself a journalist. So, what do I do as a media to convince people in the West that you cannot hold negotiations with Putin? Negotiations, because if not, NATO would be strong. Well, there's 3 years in a row. That will be different terms for Ukraine. Maybe the war would be already by now.
Well, I mean, if we go back, with the benefit of hindsight, there's various points over the last even 20 years where you could say, well, if we could have stopped Putin here, we could have stopped Putin here.
Yeah, that is true.
There are very many obvious.
Right.
There were very many obvious parallels with the rise of Hitler and again appeasement in the 1930s. And you can't avoid those comparisons. I mean, they are
obvious.
They are obvious. They are glaring. But I think you've always got to bear in mind that Western leaders and Western
audiences
are approaching this from a position of generational peace. They've lived in peace in their own countries. Now, Western countries have fought wars all over the world many times.
Proxies,
but they're a long way away. These were wars in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere perhaps in Africa, or the Falklands War with the British or something like this. They were a long way away. These people have not been in a wartime environment. since World War II, and that's their context
almost
of war.
a century by now.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting there. It's getting towards it. I mean, it's 3 generations. So you're talking about people who have really no concept of war in its truest sense, and they are understandably, I would say, extremely reluctant. I mean, not even reluctant. They can't even really.
But there's an absence of knowledge.
They can't comprehend the idea of, okay, we may have to go to war with Russia. We may, and they'll do anything to avoid that. And Putin's greatest achievement, I think, this past 3 years, his greatest success has been to intimidate the West. His use of nuclear blackmail, specifically, but also his more broader belligerence, and to intimidate the West, to scare them, to make them take a step back and say, okay, we won't give Ukraine these weapons. We won't allow Ukraine to join NATO. We won't give Ukraine guarantees. We won't allow Ukraine to use the weapons we have given in Russia, for example. All these different restrictions and limitations and half measures and hesitancy, that's all come from Putin's ability to intimidate them, because he understands that they are very, very, to put it mildly, reluctant to enter into anything that might put them in the line of fire. Again, keep it contained in Ukraine. And Putin's been able to exploit that very, very successfully, unfortunately, because of this reluctance in the West. Now, it's hard to break out of that, because that's a really...
Is that even possible?
Nothing's impossible, but it's really baked into the Western societies that we come. I mean, if we look at where Germany is today and where Germany was 3 years ago when the war was about to break out, Germany's made an incredible leap away from the sort of
shouting,
the sort of fundamentalist pacifism that it had for decades after World War II. This terrible legacy of Nazism and Hitler's regime, and they were, the pacifism was like it was almost a religion for the German people, and they couldn't countenance being involved at all. Now, the debate is, do they send ballistic missiles to Ukraine or not?
Of them,
and how many should they send? How many tanks should they send? How, they are one of the major. They are providing Ukraine with more weapons than almost any other country, any other European country, certainly. That's a huge leap. So I wouldn't be fatalistic and say nothing can be achieved, but it's still a massive issue to get these countries on board and say, guys, you've got to understand. One of the how do we do that? One of the arguments I think that's important to make is say, well, look, apart from any moral issues here, or even like simple security, defense, military issues, think about the money. If you don't stop Russia now, it's going to cost you a lot more. There was a study recently that came out, and it's obvious. If Russia is able to achieve its goals in Ukraine, and then Putin will be emboldened, even if he doesn't immediately go further, which he may do, but even if he doesn't, every single country in Europe will have to dramatically increase their spending. It won't be 2%, it'll be 4 or 5%. That's a massive expense for all these
billions
countries.
And billions.
It's maybe 3 or 4 times more the amount they're now being asked to give to finance Ukraine, which wants to fight for itself. So it really makes no sense policy-wise to say, okay, we're not, we object to spending this on Ukraine. We're not going to do it, because the cost of not doing it is so much higher.
Mr. Dickinson, thank you so very much for putting all this information in my head to the places that it belongs to, or each shelf. It's brilliant to have you here, and thank you so very much for your effort, expertise, and time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Great.